June 4th, 1944, just outside Harland, Iowa. The dawn crept over the horizon, its golden light spilling across the wet fields like molten amber. The air smelled of rain and earth, laced with the sweet hum of honey that drifted from the neat rows of beehives standing like soldiers beside the old barn. John Winslow Carson, 36, leaned against one of the wooden hive boxes, his flannel shirt sticking to his back in the heavy summer air. The bees moved around him in perfect order, disciplined, efficient, unstoppable. For a moment, John looked less like a farmer and more like a quiet commander, surrounded by a loyal, buzzing army. He dipped a spoon into a jar, watching the honey stretch in a slow ribbon before coiling back into the glass. "Sweetest thing in the world," he muttered in his gravelly drawl, "the kind shaped by tobacco and too many cold winters. But ain't nothing sweet about this war." Then came the sound, low, distant, growing. Not a tractor, not a truck. Airplanes. B-17 bombers, slicing across the morning sky, heading east, toward England, toward Europe, toward fire. John squinted against the sun, his jaw tight. He didn't wave. Who was there to wave to? His brother Mark was somewhere out there, maybe in France, maybe gone. The war had taken everyone, leaving behind only silence, sweat, and stubborn men with fields to tend. He was reaching for another jar when he heard it. A deep growl of an engine on the gravel road. A military truck, olive drab and dust-streaked, rolled up beside the barn. A soldier stepped out, clipboard in hand, voice flat and formal. "John Carson." "That's me," John answered. "You're on the list. The Army's requisitioning honey for the 8th. Says you've got 350 hives." "That's right," John said slowly. "But what the hell do you need honey for over there?" The soldier didn't blink. "Sir, we need everything, especially what lasts." As they loaded the jars into the truck, John felt something twist inside him. Half pride, half helplessness. He wasn't sending bullets or bombs. Just honey, he muttered under his breath. No one ever won a war with bespit. He was wrong. 72 hours later, that same honey, his honey, would help save a convoy of American trucks in occupied France. The newspapers never mentioned his name. To most, he was just another farmer. But to the men whose lives his idea saved, John Winslow Carson was something else entirely. Proof that even in a world built on steel and fire, sometimes victory dripped slow and golden from the combs of a beehive. Born in 1908, John had never seen the ocean, never left Iowa. He'd inherited 160 acres, a half-ruined barn, a few broken tractors, and a handful of beehives from his father. By 1935, he'd built it into one of the largest apiaries in southwest Iowa. 200 colonies, nearly 12 million bees, and 3,000 pounds of honey a year. Then came Pearl Harbor. The world changed overnight. His neighbor's sons left first, then his own brother. John tried to enlist, but the bad knee from an old tractor accident made him 4F unfit for service. The letter haunted him more than any wound could. While others fought and died across Europe, John was told to grow crops, fill quotas, feed the machine of war. But in time, it wasn't corn or soybeans that made the difference. It was the bees, and the man who refused to stop working when the rest of the world went to fight. Early 1942. The war was tightening its grip on every corner of American life, even the dinner table. Sugar, once a staple in every kitchen, became one of the most heavily rationed commodities in the nation. Before the war, the average American used about 100 pounds a year. Now, they were allowed just 26. The rest was going overseas for food preservation, explosives, and medical supplies. Deprived of sweetness, people turned to the only alternative that didn't require a ration book: honey. And so did the U.S. Army. Honey didn't spoil. It didn't freeze. It was energy-dense, antibacterial, and easy to store, a miracle from the hive. For the military, it became more than just a luxury. It was fuel for the human machine. In 1943, a government ledger at the Department of Agriculture listed a familiar name: John Winslow Carson, beekeeper, Iowa. Beside it, a notation: surplus capacity. A few weeks later, a letter arrived at John's farmhouse. Government contract, supply 700 pounds of honey to the U.S. Army Processing Facility, Des Moines. It wasn't a big deal, at least not to him. He filled the barrels, loaded them onto a truck, and went back to his hives. But somewhere far beyond his fields, men in white coats and olive uniforms were discovering new uses for his product. In medical tents and supply depots, honey was being tested on wounds, proving itself a natural antiseptic. Engineers mixed it with wax to waterproof seals and coat metal against rust. Mechanics smeared it onto creaking vehicle joints, where it dampened noise better than oil. Something ancient was becoming something tactical. And back in Iowa, John knew none of it. To him, the war was still a faraway storm, carried on the wind in the drone of aircraft and the silence of empty mailboxes. By late 1943, his small operation had exploded to 350 hives, nearly 20 million bees producing more honey than any farmer in the county. Yet the more he shipped out, the more useless he felt. Every jar vanished into the system without a word of thanks or proof it mattered. He joked bitterly to a friend, "Feels like I'm pouring it straight into the ocean." Neighbors teased him at church. "Still selling bee juice?" one said. "Maybe they'll pin you a honeycomb medal," another muttered. John laughed along, but inside, resentment simmered. 2 of his friends had been drafted. His brother Mark's last letter was months old, dated December, now April. He'd memorized every word of it, especially the line that said, "We're cold, wet, sometimes hungry, but we keep moving. If you send anything, send warmth." That single phrase, "send warmth," stuck with him like a sting. He began to see honey differently. It wasn't just food. It was energy, protection, preservation. His grandfather had once polished boots with beeswax and oil. A neighbor had once patched a radiator with it. What else could it do? One evening, while fixing a groaning hinge on his barn door, John mixed honey, linseed oil, and a bit of wax. He rubbed it into the rusted metal, and the noise vanished instantly. Smooth, silent. The next morning, a military truck rumbled into his yard earlier than usual. The corporal in charge looked exhausted, his uniform still dusty from travel. "Rough night," he said. "We lost 6 trucks in Normandy." Krauts heard him coming. Could smell the diesel a mile off. "Can't move quiet if your rigs sound like a scrap heap." John paused, then spoke without thinking. "I might have something for that." "Something for what?" "The noise. The smell. A mix I made myself, honey, wax, linseed oil. Keeps hinges quiet. Mask scent." The corporal stared at him, unsure if this farmer was joking. "You want the U.S. Army to fight with bee grease?" John didn't flinch. "No, sir. I want you to fight quieter." "Smear bee spit on army trucks?" the corporal had said, half laughing, half incredulous. John didn't blink. "Maybe save 6 trucks next time." The corporal chuckled, but his laughter faltered when he saw John's expression. Flat, steady, deadly serious. "You're actually serious?" "Dead serious." There was a long pause, then a shrug. "Fine. 1 crate. I'll take it to the boys at Fort Riley. Let them have a laugh." That night, John didn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the faint hum from his hives outside, a steady pulse in the warm Iowa dark. Days turned to weeks. No news. He went back to work, prying open frames, watching the bees' choreography. The way they sealed cracks with resin, muffled vibration, hid their scent from predators. It hit him then, the quiet irony. "They've been running stealth ops long before we ever did," he muttered. Then, on May 12th, a black army sedan rolled up the gravel road to his farmhouse. 2 men stepped out, no uniforms, no insignia, just pressed brown coats and the kind of eyes that saw through you. One wore a medic's armband, the other carried a clipboard. "We heard you've been mixing some things," the one with the clipboard said. John nodded cautiously. The other continued, "We ran a test. 3 trucks. Coated the axles, doors, exhaust with your mix." John's heart pounded. "And they ran silent," the man said simply. "Smelled like a bakery, but quiet as ghosts. Krauts didn't hear a thing until our boys were already over the ridge." He pulled a paper from his coat and handed it over. "Effective immediately. Authorized production, 100 gallons per month. Code name, Sweet Silence." John blinked. "Excuse me?" The officer smiled faintly. "Sweet Silence, Mr. Carson. Welcome to the war." Outside, the hum of bees swelled in the warm air, no longer sounding like bees at all, but like drums. He had just crossed a line no farmer ever expected to cross. From civilian to covert asset. And not even John realized just how far his stupid idea was about to go. By late May of 1944, John Winslow Carson wasn't just a beekeeper anymore. He was running a one-man war factory. His old winter storage shed had turned into a sticky, makeshift production line. Barrels of honey, vats of melted beeswax, and drums of linseed oil lined the walls. The air was thick and heavy with sweetness, almost choking. Every surface glistened. Flies battered against the windows like prisoners. Each week, a truck from Fort Riley, Kansas pulled up to collect sealed containers stamped with a single code, SSC7, Sweet Silence Compound Number 7. No names, no labels, no explanations. Then, one humid morning in June, a letter arrived. The envelope was creased, marked, via Military Postal Service. Not from Mark, but from Sergeant Benjamin Gentry, 59th Logistics Division, European Theater. The handwriting was rough, the message brief. Your stuff works. Coded 5 vehicles last week. Krauts never heard us. Got the drop on them near Corentin. 2 enemy trucks destroyed. 0 losses. Smelled like Christmas. Keep it coming. John read the letter twice, then folded it with care and slipped it into a mason jar, sealing it like a medal made of words. But questions gnawed at him. Could this really hold up? Could honey, change anything in a war of steel and fire? Or was it just one lucky miracle before the chaos swallowed it whole? He went back to work, stirring new batches, changing ratios, pushing the limits. And one morning, while brushing a thicker coat onto an old flatbed axle, he noticed something strange. The metal didn't just move quieter. It moved smoother. The compound wasn't just muting sound. It was strengthening the machine. He noticed something strange. The waxy coating didn't just silence the squeal. It absorbed the vibration too. The wheel no longer trembled against the axle. It was smoother, steadier, almost stealthy. And in a war where German acoustic sensors could pick up the rumble of an Allied convoy from miles away, that mattered more than anyone back home could imagine. So he wrote a short note, his handwriting rough but firm. Compound now acts as vibration dampener on metal surfaces. Try under vehicle hoods, side doors, exhaust seams. Also repels water. A week later, a reply arrived. This time typed, official and stamped. Tested your modifications on 8 Jeeps moving through hedges near St. Lo. Dampening reduced acoustic detection range by approximately 25%. Bravo. Authorization enclosed for increase to 200 gallons per month. Prepare for shipment to Port of Liverpool for pre-invasion outfitting. Liverpool. The word hit him like a thunderclap. Everyone knew what it meant, even if no one dared say it aloud. The invasion was coming. The Allies were preparing to storm Fortress Europe, and somehow, impossibly, his compound had become part of it. On June 3rd, a courier truck arrived under cover of dusk, headlights off, crates, barrels, papers marked confidential. The driver said nothing, just handed John the forms. Prepare 10 barrels for transatlantic shipment. Label, Class A engineering materials. Destination, confidential. No insignia, no salute, just the weight of urgency. That night, John sealed the final barrel under the dim yellow glow of a lantern. Outside, the fields were silent. The hives too. The air hung thick, still, heavy with the coming storm. Somewhere far west, thunder rolled, not from clouds but from machines. The sound of the world shifting. He didn't know it yet, but within 10 days, those barrels would be cracked open on the beaches of Normandy. Soldiers would smear his sticky, golden compound over armored doors and exhaust hoods before rolling into the deadliest stretch of road in Europe. What began as a barnyard experiment was about to cross the Channel and into history. Normandy, June 12, 1944, 6 days after D-Day. Night cloaked the countryside in smoke and rain. Convoys of American trucks rumbled through shell-pocked roads bordered by thick hedgerows. German ambushes were still a daily terror. But this time something was different. Captain Lawrence Mendel of the 3rd Armored Division later wrote, "We moved through Semiakaglis like ghosts. No hatli, no kriak, no diesel stink. Just the faint smell of molasses and mud. They were waiting for engines. Instead, we gave them silence. That silence had a name. Sweet Silence Compound Number 7. A sticky, dark coating brushed over axles, hinges, and exhausts. Field mechanics called it bee-grease. Infantrymen nicknamed it ghost syrup. Whatever they called it, it worked. And back in Iowa, John Winslow Carson knew none of this. He was still in his barn, hands blistered, arms aching, sweat stinging his eyes as he stirred the next batch. He didn't know that his barrels had reached France. He didn't know they'd already saved lives. Until June 22nd. A courier brought a manila envelope, unmarked, sealed. Inside was a single black and white photograph, grainy and torn at the edges. It showed a convoy of 6 trucks, safely parked behind a hedgerow near Carentan. A soldier crouched beside a wheel, brush in hand, tin beside him. On the back, written in pencil, "Your stuff. It saved us." John stared at the picture for a long time, unable to move. It wasn't a medal or a speech. It was proof. Proof that the bees, the barn, the sleepless nights, all of it had crossed the ocean and joined the fight. By July, sweet silence had spread across the Allied armies. The U.S. Logistics Command approved mass production. Over 400 gallons a week shipped overseas. The British requested it for their nighttime raids. The Canadians for their supply convoys through Cannes. What started with one farmer and a hive of bees had become one of the quietest and sweetest weapons of the war. Still, the secret held. The Germans noticed fewer sounds, fewer mechanical signatures echoing through the night. They blamed it on fog, on wind, on bad acoustics in the valleys of Normandy. None of them realized that a quiet farmer in Iowa, a man who once couldn't even get credit at the feed store, had created a crude form of stealth technology using nothing but nature. Then came the first real test. July 29, 1944. Near St. Lo, Allied intelligence intercepted German plans to shell a key resupply corridor. If that road was hit, 3 entire divisions would be cut off. Someone in command made a risky decision. Deploy a full convoy, 84 trucks, all coated in sweet silence. They had 6 hours to prepare. Mechanics worked by lantern light, spreading the compound with brushes, rags, even their bare hands. It was thick, sticky, pungent. The air smelled of burnt sugar and metal. By 0200, the convoy rolled out. No headlights, no raving engines, no clanking metal, just the whisper of rubber on mud and the low hum of disciplined silence. German scouts never heard them. Mortars never fired. By dawn, every truck had made it through. Not one hit, not one man lost. The after-action report was only 3 lines long. Silence preserved operational secrecy. Recommend continued use of compound SSC-7 in night convoys. A logistics miracle born from a barn. And that same morning, in Iowa, John received a small package. Inside, a worn field jacket smelling of sweat and diesel, and a short note in a familiar scrawl. "Your honey got here before I did. Mark." John folded the note, pressed it against his chest, and sat on the barn steps. The air was thick with wax and oil, but beneath it, he could still smell the bees. They smelled like home, like hope. August 20th, 1944, Falaise Gap, northern France. The war had reached a turning point. The Allies were closing in, trapping nearly 50,000 German soldiers between converging forces. If the gap held, the German army in France would collapse. If it didn't, the war might drag on for months. To keep the pressure, supplies had to move faster than ever: fuel, ammo, rations, everything. Enter Convoy Echo 9. 212 trucks, 38 jeeps, and 12 half-tracks loaded to the brim, ordered to cross into the Falaise region under the cover of darkness. At 1900 hours, the motor pool commander gave a strange order. Apply the Carson compound. Full coverage. Dozens of mechanics rolled out barrels marked SSC-7. They brushed the honey-black mixture over every hinge, axle, and hood seal until the vehicles gleamed with a dull, sticky sheen. The air reeked of linseed oil and burnt sugar. Inside one of the trucks sat Sergeant Mark Carson, 1st Armored Division, unaware that the very substance being painted onto his engine came from his brother's hands, halfway across the world. The only thing he knew was what his officer had said. "These trucks don't squeak, don't stink. You roll silent, you get there alive." By 22:30, the engines purred to life, not roaring, but whispering. The night was thick, starless, fog-drenched. No headlights, no radios, just the sound of breath, boots, and the soft rhythm of unseen movement. The convoy slipped past a German mortar unit within 1,000 meters, close enough for the men to hear faint coughing in the enemy camp. But no alarm sounded. No flares rose. The Germans never knew. Until, 10 miles in, as the trucks crept across a makeshift bridge over the Dives River, one white flare shot up, then red. Gunfire erupted. The silence shattered. The convoy split, half surging forward, half veering into a ravine to outflank the attackers. Inside one of the lead trucks, Sergeant Mark Carson grabbed the handle of a Browning .50 caliber machine gun. "Would you like me to continue the next part, the firefight at Falaise Gap, where Mark's fate and John's invention intersect for the last time?" The .30 caliber roared to life. Mark's voice crackled over the radio, strained, half drowned in static. They see us now. Move! The night exploded. Tracers ripped through the fog, the convoy scattering like startled deer. But the seconds they'd stolen, those 5 minutes of silence before discovery, had already changed everything. They were farther ahead than the Germans expected, deep enough to slip past the heaviest kill zone. Shells screamed overhead, ripping open the rear of the column. 3 trucks gone, 8 men down, none dead. The rest, 198 vehicles, thundered onward, engines wrapped in a honeyed hush. By dawn, over 100 tons of ammunition, 5,000 gallons of fuel, and 2 entire field hospitals had reached the Canadian First Army. At sunrise, the trap snapped shut, the Falaise Gap closed. 40,000 German soldiers were caught between the jaws of silence and fire. That night, as exhausted men set up triage tents and reloaded guns, one soldier lit a cigarette and muttered, "Careful, pal. This is a sugar field, you'll catch fire." The medics laughed, the first laugh anyone had heard in days. Soon, reports began circulating. Carson Compound, they called it. Engineers, medics, truck drivers, everyone had a story. Even General George S. Patton, during a debrief, mentioned it in his own gruff way. Whatever voodoo they're putting on those trucks, keep doing it. But for John Carson, the real moment came a week later. A battered envelope arrived, edges burned, stamps from France. Inside, a torn scrap of military canvas and a note in a familiar scrawl. "They used your stuff on our truck. We rolled quiet, even under fire. I shot back and lived. Some didn't, but most of us made it. Mark." John stood in the kitchen, the note trembling between his fingers. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just nodded once, slow. Then he walked outside to the hives, opened one carefully, and whispered, "You did good, girls." The bees buzzed softly around him. Oblivious, relentless, timeless. They sealed, they built, they protected. Just as he had. Just as his compound had. A sweet, sticky silence that had carried men through death and delivered them into another dawn. The legacy of a quiet trick. The war rolled on, through France, into Belgium, across the frozen Ardennes, and finally into Berlin. But for John Winslow Carson, his part ended on a still morning in September 1944, when the trucks stopped coming. No telegram, no farewell, just silence. The barrels stayed stacked by the barn door, the last of the compound sealed and waiting. John didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He knew what silence meant. His work was finished. By winter, Allied engineers were using lab-made lubricants, synthetic coatings, and compounds with names too long to pronounce. The humble beekeeper's blend, the one born from wax, oil, and stubbornness, was forgotten. But history still left a trace. In a 1946 Quartermaster Corps report, buried deep between columns about tire wear and fuel additives, one line reads, "Temporary vehicle coating designated SSC, 7 demonstrated minor but measurable improvement in stealth movement under limited field conditions." Source: civilian supplier, Iowa. No medal, no citation, just one dry sentence in a file no one would ever read. And that was enough. When the war ended and America filled its streets with ticker tape and brass bands, John went back to what he knew. He fixed his tractors, painted his barn, split his hives in time for the clover bloom. In the fields outside Harland, the bees worked as they always had, silent, tireless, and unseen. And somewhere across the ocean, on an old stretch of French road, there were still faint traces of honey in the dust. And when Mark finally came home, thinner, quieter, a little hollow behind the eyes, they didn't talk much about the war. They didn't have to. They just sat on the porch in the Iowa dusk, coffee in hand, watching the bees drift through the air like sparks from a slow fire. After a long silence, Mark said, almost to himself, "Heard they tested your stuff on the Navy, too." John cracked a grin. "Well, hell, maybe I sank a U-boat." They both laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. Time moved on. The barrels emptied. The formula, equal parts instinct, trial, and accident, faded from memory. It was never written down. It lived only in John's hands, in the rhythm of his work, in the smell of hot wax and Iowa summers. In 1953, a government inspector came by for an agricultural census. Clipboard in hand, he asked routine questions: acreage, production, livestock. Then, near the end, he looked up and asked, "Did your operation contribute to the war effort?" John hesitated. "In a way," he said slowly. "I kept some folks alive." "You grew food?" the inspector asked. No, John said, faintly smiling. I made them harder to hear. The inspector didn't write that down. By the 1960s, the old barn sagged, the compound barrels rusted to dust. But the bees were still there, patient, eternal, doing what they'd always done. They didn't need recognition. Neither did he. When John Carson passed away in 1971 at age 63, his obituary ran just 4 lines in the Harlan County Register. John W. Carson, lifelong farmer and beekeeper, died Sunday at home, survived by his brother, Mark, known locally for his honey. No mention of Normandy, no mention of trucks. But decades later, a child exploring the overgrown property found a small metal box buried beneath a rusted gate. Inside was a cracked glass jar and, folded within it, a yellowed note. Dash sweet silence. Remember us. That was all. And maybe that's enough. Because not every legacy demands a monument. Sometimes the smallest acts in the biggest wars don't need to be remembered by the world, only by the men they saved. It's easy to believe history is written by generals, tanks, and speeches that echo through marble halls. But sometimes, it's shaped by quieter hands, by a man in a barn, by a swarm of bees, by a golden substance that was never meant for war. John Carson never stormed a beach. He never fired a shot. But his honey did. It rolled through the mud of Normandy, across bridges under fire, clinging to the wheels that carried wounded boys home. And it did something few things in war ever do. It saved lives without taking any. There's something deeply American and deeply human in that idea. That even in the deadliest conflict in history, one man with a jar of honey could make the world a little quieter, a little safer. A jar of honey became a weapon of silence. And for one fleeting moment in 1944, silence was victory. So maybe it's worth asking, how many other small contributions have we forgotten? How many wars were nudged not by bullets, but by ideas? Now I'll ask you, what's the most unexpected way you've ever seen someone make a difference? Tell me in the comments below. And if this story surprised you, if it made you think differently about war, or about what it means to serve, share it. Pass it on. Because sometimes the sweetest part of history is the part we almost missed.